آزادی بیان،
言论自由。
free speech.
Take that off you there. Welcome, everybody, to this event organized by our Free Speech Debate project here at St. Antony's. There's some fantastic pieces on the website, both video and text. Do please come and visit the website freespeechdebate.com. There's an incendiary piece by Cizwe, an incendiary piece by Monica, and slightly less incendiary pieces by various other people. We're focusing this week on free speech in the university, no platforming, trigger warnings, Rhodes Must Fall, all of that. This discussion, and it is a panel discussion, it's not a ding-dong for and against debate, is entitled Rhodes Has Not Fallen, What Next for Rhodes Must Fall? So as you know, the original focus of the campaign was bring down that statue on the Oriel College facade on the High Street. Oriel has now said they're not going to take it down, so the question is what next? And as you will have seen on the poster, there's a whole range of subjects that we could talk about. Decolonizing the curriculum, more diversity in Oxford faculty, more diversity in the student body, our attitude to donors, and so on and so forth. So the way this is going to work is our four introducers are going to speak for 5 minutes, I emphasize 5 minutes, and I've asked them to concentrate on two things. Part one, what about the debate around the statue? Was the Rhodes Must Fall movement, as focused on the statue, a blow for free speech or against free speech? Did it animate a free speech debate, or did it try and close it down? What do you think about the statue and what's happened about it? Part two, what next? Let's open up all these questions, and then we'll have a debate in which I hope you'll all come in, and it won't just be Q&A. We're looking for contributions from the floor, and I'll try, probably with zero success, to structure the debate a bit from subject to subject. We have four great introducers. On my left, Cizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who is a Weidenfeld-Hoffmann scholar here doing a DPhil and an active member of Rhodes Must Fall from South Africa. On my right, Monica Richter, former Dahrendorf scholar at this college, working in the MPhil on European politics, very active in our free speech debate project. Several of our pieces are up on the website. To the far left, but not in any political sense, perhaps, David Priestley, one of our leading historians, written great books on Russia, communism, power, and power, by the way, is also a subject of this debate, the power relations in free speech, who David wrote in support of moving the Cecil Rhodes statue in Cape Town. And of course, this movement began, let's remember, in Cape Town. I actually don't know what he thinks about Oxford, so I'll be interested to hear. On the far right, but not in any political sense, my colleague and friend David Johnson, who himself comes from Southern Africa, spent much of his life in Southern Africa, and interestingly works on education. So he has, as it were, multiple special interests in this subject. So without more ado, as I say, 5 minutes, please. There may be a yellow card, then a red card. Cizwe.
Thanks very much. The future will have no pity on those men and women who, possessing the extreme privilege of being able to speak truth to their oppressors, take refuge in an attitude of passivity, of mute indifference, or even of cold complicity. This debate is not about freedom of speech. This is one of the most spurious criticisms of Rhodes Must Fall that there have been, and there's a long catalogue of spurious criticisms. This debate is about where Oxford sees itself, how it presents itself, and this is a moral and an ethical debate about ethical reflexivity. And it's about that debate that I'm going to speak for the first section of my remarks. The second section will deal with how Oxford has responded to the initial debate that we sparked. And I'm going to be arguing that Oxford's response only reinforces the need for a movement like Rhodes Must Fall more than when we initially started the campaign itself. And where do we go from there? So let's deal with some of the critique, which centers around three strands. This question of historical reflexivity, free speech, and the idea of safe spaces. Now, we've been thrown in with a hodgepodge of all kinds of movements all over the world, as if we all represent some kind of monolithic being, as if free speech and no platforming advocates in one university are all part of some grand conspiracy. Rhodes Must Fall is a movement that stands on its own, and you can't critique us by critiquing the other movements that are going on around the world. You need to deal with our arguments directly. Now let's talk about historical preservation, because this lies at the center of this question of free speech. We're not preserving history by preserving a glorificatory statue of Cecil Rhodes. What we're preserving is a self-soothing mythology. We're preserving a misleading narrative at all costs. What we're doing is drawing a ridiculous false dichotomy between historical preservation and ethical awareness. You can achieve both. If we put the statue in a museum, we would both preserve history and deal with the question of ethical awareness. There's no false dichotomy, and we should stop being straitjacketed into these extreme positions. It's also a deep obfuscation of history to imagine that Cecil Rhodes himself embodies the history of that period. If we really wanted historical accuracy, we'd probably put a statue of the 60,000 people who the British South Africa Company's police slaughtered. But where does the free speech question come into this? I mean, if free speech enters into this, it's about the fact that students, historically and currently marginalized by the Oxford dominant culture and ideology, should be allowed to ask or demand of the university that it change its current situation. If free speech enters into this, it's on the side of Rhodes Must Fall, unless there's some kind of inalienable right to a Horcrux. Unless, by some strange logic, statues enjoy free speech. We have never called for safe spaces. What we're saying is that Oxford remains a safe space for the statue of Cecil Rhodes and for the old boys club that runs it. We're not asking to be treated specially. We want to cease the special treatment of those people whose identities are affirmed by a statue of someone who slaughtered 60,000 people and is responsible for the destruction of hundreds of millions of lives through the institution of apartheid, both in South Africa and in places like Zimbabwe. So we think that this whole free speech attack on Rhodes Must Fall is spurious. We've never criticized anyone's ability to debate with us. We've always taken public platforms. We've actually invited people who disagree with us to public platforms which they refused. And we fail to see how free speech enters into this in a critique of Rhodes Must Fall. Having said that, let's deal now, secondly, with the university's response to this campaign, which is quite frankly shameful. A group of students asked for a statue to be removed. And by the way, nobody's calling for anything to be torn down or exploded or anything. That's just ridiculous. We've said, would you remove this statue which we think enjoys undue pride of place? And Oriel College says, okay, we're going to listen to you. And 2 weeks into the term, they turn around and say, oh, you know that whole debate thing? That's done. Unfortunately, we're not going to debate anymore. What on earth does that say about the university, about Oriel, about the refusal to engage in a debate? What really happened was that they started the debate and Rhodes Must Fall actually started winning it. I mean, we won at the Oxford Union, hardly a bastion of racial radicalism. And then suddenly, when they realized that people were listening to these arguments and realizing that these arguments had merit, the whole debate was shut down. And they turn around and accuse us of being against free speech. let's not even go into the donor question and whether that means that anytime students or the wider university sparks a conversation and a donor has a problem with it, that ends the debate. But nobody seems to think that that's a threat to free speech in Oxford. And finally, we have my favorite protagonist in this whole question, Lord Patton, who gets on radio as the... Do you know what you'd have to do to be the Chancellor of Oxford if you were black? You would have to have cured cancer, be the Secretary General of the United Nations, and an all-round good guy or woman, or someone who's gender non-conforming. Some mediocre former colonial governor is the Chancellor of Oxford, and he gets on radio and starts telling people that if we disagree with having a statue of Cecil Rhodes, we must go elsewhere, and then compares us to the Chinese government. And free speech is against Rhodes Must Fall? Shame on Lord Patton. He should actually, quite frankly, resign for that statement and what it means and how harmful it was to this entire debate. So we think that there's even more of a need for us to focus on Oxford's problem of racial bias. We're going to continue with our demands for iconographical change in addition to the wider changes that we think are needed at this university, because we think they're all interlinked. And the university's response only reinforces the need for this conversation, the need for this debate, and the need for a movement like Rhodes Must Fall to rid us of the harmful ideologies that continue to persist in this university. Thank you.
Monica.
Thank you. So I'm coming to this issue from a slightly different perspective, but my goal is to be conciliatory and to hopefully dispel some of the criticisms that have been likewise made about the opposing camp in this debate. So I'm not sure that free speech is really the primary issue at stake here as far as the statue is concerned. I agree with Cecil in that. And I think it's fair to say that we've actually seen quite a lot of heated and conflicting discussion. If anything, I would say that it's certainly true that the university and Oriel College as well have been slower or more reluctant to address the issues raised, and to that end have been rather dismissive of RMF. I also think it's true that those with reservations about RMF have had no shortage of opportunities to voice their opposition and have been backed by Oxford's highest leadership, indeed Lord Patton, and Louise Richardson, those who wield the most institutional power. So I would be very cautious indeed about claims that the campaign is trying to shut down debate. I think that's often a red herring for maligning the campaign and delegitimizing its grievances. Similarly, what I also think is disingenuous is the criticism that RMF is endeavoring to whitewash history. In fact, I think an argument could be made for the opposite case, that the campaign is actually overemphasizing or perhaps hyperbolizing a particular historical issue and symbol in order to advance its political agenda. This is a problem insofar as such a parochial focus detracts from real-world substantive social justice that directly improves the lives of people today. I know that my colleagues on the panel will likely disagree with me on this, but to refute the point about whitewashing history, I think that is nonsense. Because removing a statue does not amount to historical denial. Statues are tools of commemoration, either implicitly or explicitly. They endorse their subject. Rightfully, we do not erect statues of Hitler, and statues of Stalin are being taken down across Russia and Eastern Europe still today. And we frequently justify taboos on certain symbols and iconography like Nazi swastikas and the Confederate flag in the United States. I would say that none of these things amount to an erasure of history. What I will say, though, is that my experience discussing the RMF campaign with students here is that disagreement with its goals or its methods is not well received or well tolerated. What I've noticed, and granted I think this does go both ways, is a tendency to interpret the opposing camp very uncharitably without regard for the sincerity of intentions. And that's what's fundamentally destructive to the debate and to free speech, if you will. The prospect of being labeled unprogressive or racist happens often enough to deter many from speaking. And that is an issue. So how should we see Rhodes today in light of all of the recent debate? I would say that we should see Rhodes as a particularly unpleasant product of his time, but a product of his time nonetheless. And obviously that doesn't exonerate him in any way. We know that he was even condemned for his zealotry by many of his own peers. But I do think that the question of judging him today is not as entirely straightforward as we would like it to be. There are many historical figures of great significance who shaped the world through unjust and often very brutal means. But that doesn't make their legacies black and white. I agree that Rhodes' legacy might be darker than others, but I also think that it appears darker to us, or feels darker, because he lived recently enough that he remains a more vivid example in our historical memory. As Rhodes Must Fall has shown, many people ostensibly continue to feel that impact today. The question that I would like to raise is why that is. Why now, in 2016, is there suddenly this enormous revival of outrage and grievance against him? And further, is that revival actually constructive? You might say that the fact that we're here and having this conversation today is proof that it is constructive. But I do think that the jury is actually still out on that. So far, Rhodes Must Fall has been very good at garnering attention, but not so good at affecting real change and making a tangible impact on people's lives. Arguing about an inanimate statue seems rather parochial in the hierarchy of social justice, particularly considering the systemic problems and inequality that we will be discussing later in this discussion. So the thing about symbols is that they are malleable. They are fundamentally social constructs, and we mold them to suit our political purposes. Rhodes Must Fall has deliberately sought to invest in the statue a range of symbolic meanings to further its own political agenda. Perhaps this is precisely its goal and its strength. But what it also engenders, I think, is a narrative of victimhood that erodes the progress that has been made in making the best of what Rhodes left us, namely the scholarship trust, and the opportunities for many students who would not otherwise have them. My main problem with Rhodes Must Fall thus far has been its preoccupation with a relatively inconspicuous statue, again, when there are enormous obstacles of equality of opportunity and access in British higher education. If we're talking greater social justice, then these are the issues that acutely need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. David.
Thank you. I first came across this issue slightly less of the Rhodes statue, slightly less than a year ago, when The Guardian asked me, as a historian, not of South Africa or of British Empire, but of Eastern Europe, to comment on South African students' demands to remove the Cape Town statue of Cecil Rhodes. And this was before this issue had become a big thing here, although I think Rhodes Must Fall was just starting in Oxford. And in my article, I thought about this as a historian, and I thought, well, this is just a rather typical conflict over the public memorialisation of history that happens in many countries. People and societies and institutions put up statues in public spaces to celebrate particular figures and ideas that they embody, and then in the future, those ideas become no longer seen as acceptable by particular groups. There are demands to take them down. If those ideas are sufficiently unpopular, then those statues are often moved to other public spaces, i.e. museums or parks, where they can be contextualised historically. And we see this in lots of societies. So, for instance, recently, something I've been following quite a lot is the issue of the statues of Lenin in Eastern Europe, and most recently in Ukraine. Like Rhodes, these actually are seen in Eastern Europe not necessarily just as statues embodying communism, but also glorifying imperialism, i.e. Soviet imperialism. And of course in the Baltics and Ukraine, there are supporters of these statues as well as opponents, and there are big arguments about these statues. And interestingly, it's often the issue of empire that is particularly controversial when it comes to these statues. So one thinks about, say, the big rows that are still going on about the very prominent statue of Leopold II in Brussels. There have been big arguments there about it. Leopold II was, if anything, more brutal even than Rhodes. And there are many who support it. So in 2010, when there was a big row about it, the then Foreign Minister, Louis Michel, said that the statue should remain because Leopold was a visionary and a hero. Now, naturally, lots of people object to that. So I put the argument, the story about the issue of Rhodes in that context in the article, and I said it's perfectly reasonable, perfectly normal for people to want to move these statues and put them into museums or parks. So there's a big monument park in Moscow where you can see fallen statues of Lenin and Stalin. There's a big statue park called Coronation Park in Delhi where you've got lots of imperial viceroys. This is perfectly normal process. So I was pretty amazed and stunned and disappointed, to say the least, when the debate blew up in Britain over the Oxford statue, and it was dominated by this issue of free speech and no platforming. Now, as everybody seems to be agreeing, this is bizarre. This is not an issue of free speech. I mean, I take a very liberal view of no platforming, and yet at the same time, I'm very anti-no platform, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to move statues in public space, glorifying certain ideas that are no longer seen as acceptable. You can move those to museums. So why did the debate become so distorted? Now, I followed the debate carefully, and it was clear to me that this was an agenda initially set by the right-wing press, by the Telegraph and the Mail in particular, and it was a very clever strategy from their point of view. Like Louis Michel in Belgium, they don't want the British Empire questioned, and this is for perfectly legitimate reasons. They have political views which they think the empire should be presented as a good thing. But interestingly, unlike Michel in Belgium, they don't want to say so openly, because the elite discourse is more anti-empire and more pro-cosmopolitan, if you like, than it is in Belgium. So instead, they have to move the debate away from those issues, the real issue, to the unrelated issues of free speech, and then to try and delegitimise the RMF campaigners. So they want to portray the campaigners as fanatics who are obsessed with these safe spaces, or as silly people who want to destroy all statues, including statues of Henry VIII, so we'll have empty plinths throughout the land, apparently, or even as ISIS-type iconoclasts who want to smash things up. Now, the right were very successful in framing, if you like, the debate. What was more disappointing and surprising was that the left, and even the academic left, went along with that, and I think of our own Will Hutton, Mary Beard, the Cambridge academic, but of course, if they had represented the debate, if the right had represented the debate as one of memorialisation and statuary, which it should have been about, then it would have been much more difficult for them to win. I mean, I didn't hear the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, or indeed the Chancellor of this university condemning the removal of Lenin statues in 1989 on the grounds that this was challenging free speech or erasing history. So why was the right's agenda so successful? And I think this will be an interesting subject for a future DPhil student, perhaps in 20 years' time. And I think in my first meeting with that DPhil student, I might, if I was supervising, if I was still around, and, or not sort of retired or too aged, I would suggest they consider the following hypothesis. What we're seeing here, I think, is a very contentious debate over the content of British identity and nationalism, and the role of empire within it, at a time when Britain is under challenge over Europe, what's its role in the EU, what the place of Scotland, of course, Scottish independence, and of course the rise of an English nationalism. Now, the 1990s saw an effort to rehabilitate the British Empire from right-wing historians like Neil Ferguson, who were anti-European. They were in favour with an alliance with George W. Bush, his new, as they saw it, a liberal global empire. In the early 2000s, people like Gordon Brown sought to rescue a sanitised version of empire for the left and integrate it within a progressive nationalism. British nationalism, I think that Cameron and Gove, of course, are trying to do the same, but obviously in a rather more right-wing and a rather less nuanced view of imperialism. Now, I think it's fair enough to have a debate about British nationalism, and it's fair enough to ask about what the place British Empire should have in that and how it should be taught in the curriculum and those issues. But people should have an open discussion about it. As RMF tried to do, they should not try and close down the debate by presenting anybody who wants to reject it as a load of fanatics. And here I think I would disagree with Monica here. I think that in a way, the consensus in favour among elites, among the elite in Britain, and also among various, and even the population, is quite pro-imperial. And I think you've got to engage in symbolic politics and challenge statues, if you things like Rhodes statue, if you're going to have an impact. I don't think it's at all parochial to criticise the Rhodes statue. Indeed, I think the reaction of the media, the rather hysterical reaction of the right-wing media, shows that they're absolutely onto something. Now to finish, sorry, I know I'm over time, but what way forward? I mean, I think at the moment we're in a very bad place, and I think, I'm afraid the recent speech of the Chancellor, the University Chancellor, who told people who didn't agree with his position on the Rhodes statue to think about being educated elsewhere, does not make Oxford look like an inclusive place, to say the least. And this is only reinforcing an already poor reputation among ethnic minorities. I was speaking to one of my colleagues who's a historian here, not at all a radical, but is on is a trustee, a governor of an academy school in inner city London with a high ethnic minority population, and who is involved in trying to get people to apply to Oxford and Cambridge. And he says the real problem is that these students there think Oxford and Cambridge are just these weird places in Middle England full of conservative white English people, and just places they don't want to go. They want to go to more diverse places. And in a way, this just reinforces that. So we have a long way to go if we're to challenge that perception and to live up to our claim to be an inclusive, an ethnically inclusive and also a global international university where global students and ethnic minority British students feel welcome. So I think in the discussion we really need to think very carefully about how we should go forward on this and how we might be able to address what is now really a very poor reputation, and in a way an even poorer reputation that Oxford now has as a result of this very disappointing and sad outcome.
Thank you very much, David. David.
I think that's on. Is that on? Thanks very much, Tim. And thank you, colleagues. Hard to know where to start with my opening remarks, but maybe appropriate, Tim, just to say I looked at the title of the talk and thought, well, actually, in my view, Rhodes has fallen, and I weed on his grave in the Metopus. The important thing about that statement is that a lot of the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, I think, is locked, unfortunately, into a question about the psychology of colonialism. It's important, perhaps, for me just to say a little bit about myself. I'm now, of course, I'm British, but I was, some many moons ago, a student leader in South Africa at the University of Wits. And I was banned and put under house arrest for 5 years for my political views. I was also detained under the Suppression of Communism Act and the Writers' Assembly Act and spent time in prison throughout every one of my 4 years at university for being a believer in free speech and willing, of course, to do two things. One, to fight for it. So I led the student movement, the tearing down of the South African Republic Day flag, and which is one of the reasons I was banned, for leading student movements in the country to speak out against the apartheid system, and particularly in education. But the one thing about that lesson, right, so the Rhodes Must Fall campaign is not a new campaign. It is but this is what saddens me. One should have been able to see it as a continuation of a student struggle against protracted issues. Of course, apartheid has fallen in South Africa and Zimbabwe was liberated in the 1980s. But to understand Rhodes Must Fall today means that we need to understand the history of the struggle for against oppression and for freedom in South and Southern Africa. I think one of the lessons I learned as a student leader of the time, that there were, of course, student issues at the University of Wits or Cape Town or elsewhere. And as I said before, we weren't scared to voice our objection to this. But the objection was always carefully linked and associated with the national struggle for freedom and liberation. It wasn't an isolated struggle. And this is what saddens me about Rhodes Must Fall, in that taking down a statue is neither here nor there. I don't think that really is the issue. I think the issue is the statue, of course, symbolizes something. In my view, it symbolizes, for many people, it symbolizes a kind of psychological weakness. Why would a statue, whether it is in Cape Town or in Oxford, be such a powerful reminder against colonialism when we have other symbols in the men and women who have fought throughout Southern Africa for liberation? I mean, the national liberation movements in Zimbabwe, ZANU and ZAPU, when Mugabe came to power in 1980, and Joshua Nkomo, of course, having fought those particular struggles, were focused on much bigger issues. When the African National Congress, perhaps the oldest national liberation movement on the continent, formed in 1912, could have chosen so many different symbols against colonialism, Rhodes being one of them. Clearly, there isn't anyone in those national liberation movements who would for one moment have thought that Rhodes wasn't anything but a loathsome colonist, robber, and downright scoundrel. But that wasn't the focus. The focus was on bigger things. So I suppose what I really want to say is, it would be almost disingenuous of me to say that I don't sit back and actually think very highly of students involved in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, struggles against apathy and lethargy, and it's a wonderful movement. But I think it's slightly misguided, I'm afraid, misguided in the sense that it has become divisive in Oxford, but principally it's become divisive in South Africa. Many of my friends in South Africa are vice-chancellors of universities, none who speak very highly of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, because they've been involved, as many others have been, for years and years, trying to dismantle the histories of apartheid and to build universities and places of learning that justify the struggles of those that have gone before them. The student campaigns in Cape Town and elsewhere in South Africa under the Must Fall label have been divisive. They've not aligned themselves to very much of a national character of struggle. They've divided communities, they've divided academic communities, they've separated lecturers from students, they've separated black students from black students. So, I won't go much further, but I think to understand the movement and where it needs to go is perhaps to understand the history of the liberation struggles in South Africa that have never been monolithic campaigns, that have been campaigns of black liberals against black radicals, that have been campaigns that have ultimately been won by those who had a much broader sense of the political strategy and political tactics to overcome the bigger enemy, not the smaller.
Thank you very much, David. 4 really fascinating sets of introductory remarks. Can we have a go at the statue and then try and move on to the rest? I mean, we have 7 demands from Rhodes Must Fall here, and only one is about the statue, and it's recontextualize iconography, i.e. the statue. But on the statue, let me just mention a few questions that come to mind, it seems to me, and then invite you, the audience, to come in specifically on the statue. Number one, Cecil, you said in passing, is it only statues that enjoy free speech? I mean, there is in there, Max Harris made this point, a perhaps slightly academic but interesting one, about whether statues, in some sense, should enjoy free speech rights. I mean, you could argue that societies also speak through their architecture, through their statuary. G.K. Chesterton said that tradition is a democracy of the dead. And this is an idea which would not be at all strange to Confucians, that in some sense past generations have a voice and they're speaking through the statuary. That's one small point. Secondly, I think it'd be good to know what we mean, more what we mean by recontextualize. Yeah, I'd like to unpack that word. What would it mean to recontextualize? You could, for example, just have a plaque on the building which said this man was a rogue and a scoundrel and a colonizer and so on, or why do you want to go further than that? Thirdly, there's been an interesting difference between Monica and David and Cecil and David, namely, was it right or wrong to focus on this little statue? I have to tell you, Cecil, you have one great achievement, which is I've lived off and on for 40 years in Oxford. I had absolutely no idea there was a statue of Cecil Rhodes up on that facade. I mean, I don't think anyone who walked up with it, because it was right up there, hidden away, whereas unlike in Cape Town. Now, I sure as hell know there's a statue of Cecil Rhodes there, and so does every reader of the Daily Telegraph, because it was just a brilliant move to focus on that statue, because it made the perfect front page photograph for the Telegraph and the Mail and the Times and everybody else. And it was a brilliant piece of activism to focus, I think entirely legitimate one, to focus our attention on the statue, which up till then had been gathering dust and pigeon shit, you know. Fourthly, it does seem, I mean, David Priestland was very amusing about empty plinths across the land, but the question why only Rhodes is surely a legitimate one. I mean, this university is built on the ill-gotten gains of centuries of war criminals, arms dealers, and other scoundrels of various kinds. The warden of New College once came to St. Antony's and said, our colleges have one thing in common, they were both founded by arms dealers. Not to mention the Said Business School, and so one could go on. So that, I mean, I think there is an interesting question about why only Rhodes, and it's not just a rhetorical device, where would this end? There's a valid question, where would this end? Now, I hope that those few questions give some food for thought. Can we please have contributions from the floor, comments or questions? Please identify yourselves, preferably keep them brief. If a question, please say who it's directed to, and then we'll come back to the panel, specifically on the statue. Richard Davey.
Surely the reason why there is a statue of Rhodes on Oriel College has nothing directly to do with his appalling colonial record. It's because he gave a lot of money to the college and to the scholarship program. In other words, it's saying he did some very good things as well as some bad things, and it's celebrating the good things he did. However, if you feel that this money is so contaminated by his colonial record, then surely the next step is to close down the Rhodes Scholarship Program and funnel the money in some way back into South Africa. Is that really what you want?
Thank you very much, Richard. So could you hold that question, and we'll take a few more. On the statue itself, I think we glided slightly off the statue there. Would anyone else like to come in on the statue? Yes.
Hi, my name's Tom. Some people seem to have suggested, why should we focus any attention on the statue, because it doesn't really matter compared to the big things. It's basically not very important. If it's not very important, why is there so much resistance to getting rid of it? Every single day that there's delay and resistance, every single speech and article that resists getting rid of the statue imbues it with more and more symbolic importance. You're not going to make it easier by continually saying this doesn't matter. It matters more the more you say that.
Right. Can we take that one? There was a lady there, I think. Yeah.
My name is Gabriella. Does the statue mean the same in Cape Town as it does in Oxford? And how does the movement incorporate sort of the awareness of the statue into what you're asking?
Very good question. We could add to that, who decides what a statue means? How are these imputed meanings created? Nicholas Stadlen.
Nick Stadlen, I'm visiting Philip Semantics. Just following up on that last question, it does seem to me that there is a difference between the significance of the statue in Oxford and in Cape Town, because in Cape Town it is a living symbol and has living meaning to people who go every day to that university and see somebody who for them is a symbol of real oppression. In Oxford, as Timothy said, he's lived here for 40 years, he didn't know it was there. I went up and down the high street today, having been educated at the wrong university, looking for it and couldn't find it. When eventually I did find it, I could see it was so high up you couldn't see it. And one of the significant things it seems to me about the statue is that it's been a very effective way of leading a campaign to get people to talk about whether there is or isn't institutional racism in Oxford. But if you ask the question, is the resistance to removing the statue because people who resist it are in favour of Rhodes, or are in favour of racialism, or are in favour of machine gunning 60,000 Africans 100 years ago? The answer is of course not. And the difference, it seems to me, is that a month ago I was involved in bringing the surviving defendants of the Rivonia trial over to London, and they were honoured by the Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street, who made a very gracious speech saying that having heard what they sacrificed in order to get the right to vote, it made him feel that what he does on a daily basis is pretty small beer. And I don't think you would look, there was one person at the Oxford Union debate who made a stab at it, but you would look long and far, I think, to find people who have anything good to say about Rhodes. And therefore it is in a sense a manufactured issue in order to draw attention to issues that are genuine, which is people, as it has emerged over the last few weeks, have real criticisms about the institutional racism, whether they're valid or not. I'm not in a position to judge, but if people think they're valid, it's a legitimate debate to have.
Would anyone else like to come in on these issues? Max Harris.
Just on the statue being divisive, isn't it the case that any activist campaign with true camps and forcefully held views is divisive? I mean, wasn't the end of apartheid divisive? Wasn't the end of communism divisive? And if so, how do we distinguish between productive activism that divides opinion and unproductive activism that divides opinion? And why is this a case of unproductive activism that divides opinion?
Great, thanks very much. So we have Rhodes Scholarship, context meaning South Africa, Oxford. If it's so unimportant, why is it so important? Why is there so much resistance to it? Which to some extent goes to Nick Stadlen's question, that why are people objecting to the statue being taken down? Is that an expression of racism? And then the divisive issue which David raised. Cecil, do you want to kick off? Sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of the statements that have been made kind of fall into a number of themes. So I think the first one is this idea that you can separate out the glorification of Rhodes from the question of institutional racism or the broader problems of a lack of representation in the professoriate or the student body at Oxford. And I think this is a spurious notion, and this is exactly what we aimed at with the strategy of Rhodes Must Fall. Because we knew that if we said we want to make Oxford a more inclusive place, everyone would shout hurrah and pump their fists in the air. We knew that if we said we want a more diverse people have been saying that for generations and nobody took notice. But we wanted to hone in on the deep need to defend this statue. And I don't know on what basis people say the defense of that statue has nothing to do with the way people's identities have been constructed in Britain. You don't have to be a rabid racist to declare publicly that you believe in the inferiority of blackness, to want to hold on to a symbol of somebody who killed as many people as Rhodes did and not think that that death matters. We think there's a subtle hierarchy that takes place, sometimes unconscious, sometimes conscious in Oxford, which we get at when we focus on the Rhodes statue. And you can't hide from it. You can't run away from it. And you deeply desire to protect this statue for reasons that continue to remain unclear. If either you think it's invisible, or you think it doesn't matter, or you think it's not tied to racism, why then keep the statue? So that's the first question. The second is this question of the slippery slope that comes up again and again. And yeah, again, I think this is really unfair because we're put into this false dichotomy where either we raise Oxford to the ground or we keep the status quo and nothing changes. And we've been temperate in our calls exactly for that reason. We're not saying everything has to go, but we're saying that in order for Oxford to demonstrate its commitment to wanting to become a more inclusive place, it needs to take certain symbolic steps, some of which may include stopping glorifying racists who killed tens of thousands of people and instituted apartheid. Now, if that is disconnected, if the way that the space is designed is disconnected from how people feel in the space, then that's a very strange notion. So we want to include people in a space that's designed and rigged against them. Why would we want to do that? And that's why we've made this about the way the space is designed and the material challenges that students from those backgrounds face. And then we have a strange notion as well that this is somehow to do with the Cape Town and the Oxford questions. Now, there's no doubt that the statues exercise power in public spaces in different ways. But that doesn't mean that in one context they're morally appropriate and in another context they're not. It just means that the power they exercise is different. And we would suggest that why should the statue be morally acceptable in Britain and not in South Africa? Nobody's actually advanced an argument for why that should be the case. Why should the lives lost, why should the destruction caused by Rhodes not matter to British people when they walk past the statue, but matter to South African people? Sure, the pain is more real and there are more people affected by it in South Africa, but there's no argument to suggest that somehow those lives mean less just because we happen to be seeing the statue in Britain. So there would need to be some kind of argument which would differentiate between why we can glorify a 20th century dictator in the country of their origin, but not in a place where they went on some kind of genocidal tirade. And we, again, and I think this has been part of the central argument we've been trying to make, is you can't just export your outrage to the colonial outpost. You have to engage with it right here, right where you are, because this is where it started. And had there not been that ideology, had there not been that racist glorification at the time in Oxford, had we challenged it at that time more successfully, then we can see the effects of how it manifests all around the world. So if anything, I think it's more important that we challenge it at Oxford, given the spillover effects that a place like Oxford has for global power.
Thank you very much, Cecil. Just a very quickie. First of all, would you accept the formulation that you focused on the statue in order to get people to look seriously at other things?
Well, on the one hand, it's very difficult. There are hardly any black students at Oxford, so we can't do everything. So we had to think, how do we actually get people's attention? So obviously we couldn't focus on every single problem with Oxford because that would be very difficult. So we had to do this strategically. And you're perfectly right that the Rhodes statue we chose as a strategic emblem. But that doesn't mean that it's not important. So we think that the Rhodes statue is a necessary but not sufficient condition for Oxford to engage with the change that it needs. It may well have been Rhodes House. It may well have been the Codrington Library. We had to choose one because we thought that that would center the debate. But there's no reason why there aren't other symbols which we should engage with. And I think the slippery slope argument, yes, we may actually have to do that. Why are we so scared of engaging with other symbols? And I think this is one thing that we've brought out, is that people are so scared to deal with this question because they know what this question means for other questions, and that was part of our strategy. And so we may have to deal with those. We may actually realize that in certain contexts we should contextualize this statue. In certain contexts, this crosses a threshold and it should be removed or put in another place. But I think we should have that more honest debate about the wider iconographical context instead of shutting our ears every time Rhodes is mentioned, because then we have to tear down all of Oxford.
And the Rhodes Scholarships?
The Rhodes Scholarships and the broader question that you raised about the so-called good things that Rhodes did. Well, I'm not sure it's a very good thing to plunder wealth from Southern Africa and then bribe the future with a scholarship to make people in the future think that you were this complex figure. That's not a way of compensating for the extreme damage that Rhodes did in Southern Africa. And in fact, the scholarship for its first 70 years only had one black student. It's only benefited about 100 black Southern African students. So it's not clear to me that the Rhodes Scholarship or the bequest to Oriel exonerates Rhodes in any way. But it is a good thing that people now are able to benefit from that scholarship. So I think we can differentiate from the glorification of Rhodes and the scholarship. I think it would be a good thing if the Rhodes Scholarship changed its name. I think it would be a good thing if Rhodes House changed its name. I think they should offer many more scholarships to black Southern Africans. I think it's shameful how few have actually benefited, even post-apartheid. So we've got to stop this question of saying either we do away with everything and Oxford will never be the same, or we do nothing. I think we can be temperate. I think we can change the name of the scholarship. I think we can engage with the way we continue to unreflexively glorify Rhodes while still keeping the aspects of that legacy, even though he may not have intended it, which are a good thing today.
Thanks very much. Who else would like to come in? David, would you?
Thanks very much. I think there was a question about the refusal to get rid of the statue. I think of the gentleman there. I think my view on that is the refusal to get rid of the statue is not a refusal to get rid of the statue. It is a refusal, I think, from Oriel and other sectors of Oxford to participate in the politics of contestation, such as we now see in South Africa. I don't think, as people around the room have said, there are many apologists for Rhodes, but the form of the debate, which takes a lot of its steam from South Africa, the sort of politics of headbanging. Let's deal with things through political contestation. I mean, has been hallmarks of campaigns for many, many decades. But I'm not sure that either Oxford or many parts of Britain have the appetite for the politics of contestation in that way. Although I live and teach in Oxford, I also have a home in Bristol. And this is important because I work within the black community in Bristol. And a few years ago, one of the most divisive issues for that city was the question of the Colston's statue and the naming. You have Colston's Hall, you have the statue erected. There was a big consultation in that city about what its new city centre that had been developed would be called. Would it be called the Colston Centre and so on? And of course the black community came out in force saying we can't glorify a slave trader, right? So Bristol went through pains. I mean, the question of the Colston statue, interestingly, that still occupies a prominent place in Bristol. But the debate was to bring on board the black community. And it took, the best part of 2 years to resolve the debate. But this wasn't a debate of political contestation of, it was a debate that took on board some of the concerns that many black people in Bristol still have around anti-racism, on housing, transport, and so on and so forth, such as some of the demands in the Rhodes campaign. But I think the important lesson from Bristol to Oxford was the attempt of the community to de-link a debate about the ire that a statue of a slaver drew to the real debate on anti-racism, housing, and so forth. So that perhaps also answers the question about the notion of divisive actions and activities. And I think something is divisive. Of course, division has been a feature of politics. But if the politics is one that seeks and searches for solutions that satisfy across a number of sectors, however hard those solutions are to find, then it is one that should attempt to mediate the sort of divisiveness that is possible.
Thank you, David. Monica.
Thank you. So just a couple of points on the recontextualization of the statue, and then the question about the Rhodes Scholarship. So one thing that I'd like to actually direct to Cecil's way is that, I mean, he has emphasized the symbolic importance of the statue and the decision, or the strategic decision, to choose it as an emblem, and that despite this, it should still be removed. So my question is, what if Oxford actually did engage substantively with the real issues of inequality and social justice on campus, and actually made progress in this regard? Would that be enough, or would we still have to remove the statue? So with regard to the recontextualization, I mean, I think that there would need to be an acknowledgement of both Rhodes' negative and, even though this is perhaps a poor way of putting it, positive legacies, because, I mean, anything else would be intellectually dishonest. This goes back to my earlier point about legacies not being simply black and white. Again, in this case, it is certainly true that the negative is quite a bit greater than the positive. But interestingly, it seems to me that the very need to recontextualize the statue seems to indicate that many people are unfamiliar with Rhodes' history. There's an explicit desire to educate behind this initiative, and that's quite interesting. So I would argue that, of course, Oriel College isn't guilty of glorifying Rhodes simply because his statue is on the facade of the building that was funded with his money. But I wonder, is the college responsible for educating people about Rhodes? I'm somewhat on the fence about that. On the one hand, his deeds are well documented, and those people who are interested in understanding his life can go read about him. There's no secret about who he was. But that said, of course, I don't think that being wholly neutral about historical figures that are still of significance to Oxford is appropriate either. So I do think that recontextualization would be the appropriate response. And with regard to the Rhodes Scholarships, I frankly think that it means nothing of substance for the Rhodes Scholarship. I think it's a non-issue given the enormous social return that it has now provided with having funded over 8,000 students from around the world to study here and then return to serve their countries and their communities. I think that any attempt to malign the Rhodes Trust, what it does, or the contemporary legacy that it has carved out for itself, is mendacious. Obviously, there's an important distinction to be made between the Rhodes Scholarship on the one hand and its founder on the other. But in my view, the trust has made that distinction. I don't believe that it lionizes Rhodes. But I don't know how recent that change in thinking actually is. I guess the wonderful advantage that we have is that Rhodes is long dead. We have the money that he left us, and we can use it according to the moral standards of the present day to make the world better. And I have to say that I actually find that a deeply satisfying thought. Is that not the way of the world, molding historical legacies as time goes by to suit our current circumstance? Isn't that actually empowering? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's also, we should just note that there are also Mandela Rhodes scholarships. So Nelson Mandela allowed his name to be associated with Rhodes, which is something we might spend a moment on. David.
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of two big issues I think came up in the questions. One is the sort of charge that concentrating on the statue is a sort of trivial thing. You know, so there are much more important things than the statue. And there's things about divisiveness. So firstly, on the triviality issue, in a way, the point you made about, everybody agrees, nobody's racist, nobody would support Rhodes. Why is one attacking Rhodes? This is a sort of, firstly, it's a trivial example, but it's a rather specific example. Thirdly, it doesn't really reflect on broader issues. Well, not only, I think I would disagree with that, because not only has there been an extremely angry and upset response from the right, in the press. I think in that way that shows that it's not a trivial issue, that this is actually a very, by concentrating on the statue was absolutely the right, if you want to stir up a debate, it's absolutely the right thing to concentrate on. Why is it? Not because people support racism, but because a lot of people want to think that the British Empire was a good thing. And I think a poll in The Independent quite recently, during this whole issue, said 65% or so of the population broadly think the British Empire was a good thing. And also they really do not want to do anything very much about, they're not particularly worried about issues of multi-ethnicity and racism and national identity, I suppose. Those are the issues of national identity. And they're rather opposed to doing anything very much about this. Now, on the latter point, I don't know what people's views are generally, but I suspect there may be an opposition, at least on the right. I'm not saying the majority of the population, but at least on the right, there would be a hostility to really taking this whole issue of trying to be more inclusive ethnically, and they would see it as a way of somehow challenging national identity. We see these issues, that arise during these debates about the curriculum, for instance, in the Gove era, when he was Minister of Education. So I think these are very big issues. They're very important issues about national identity, and in a way, focusing on this statue was a way of raising those issues, which are generally not discussed, actually. And a good friend of mine who's a French historian, a historian of France and is half French, says, well, actually, there are many more discussions about the empire in France, quite contentious ones. There's much more discussion in France than there is in Britain. There's much more consensus in Britain on these issues. And that consensus, I would say, has moved to the right and to a more pro-empire position in the last decade or so. Now, then there's the question about divisiveness, which is, in a way, what you were raising, and an interesting point from here about divisiveness. So, is this really the right way to do it? Are there better ways of raising these issues, and is divisiveness just going to entrench positions? Well, I mean that I think is something to really to think about. My own view. As an insider in Oxford, who is aware of the very great difficulty of raising issues, and there are very good reasons why it's very difficult to change things like curriculum or to change things like admissions. And I don't think there is racism, generalised racism in the faculty in Oxford, in the faculty I know, the people I know. But it's very difficult to shake up complacency on these issues. And in a way, a campaign like this is rather good at trying to do that. So, I'm open to the argument that divisive campaigns actually make things worse. But I'm not really sure, at the moment I really don't agree with that. I think that actually you need campaigns like this to shake things up, to make people think about it, because there are many reasons why people do not want to do anything about it. Not because they're racists, but because there are lots of institutional drags on change. And institutions like Oxford University are conservative institutions with a small c.
Thanks very much. Now, can we try and move on to these larger issues? And I'll take some comments, including the curriculum, and take some comments from the floor. I would just say, I do think Nick Stadlen is right, just factually, from a lot of conversations, that a lot of the reaction to the proposal, specifically on the statue, was just at the level of, don't mess around with historic buildings. Now, that may be highly unreflected, and there may be, if we unpack that, you may find interesting things about our attitude to our own history, which I believe is indeed the case. But I think what a lot of people were saying, I think it's not fair to say they were sort of great defenders of the empire and racists because they said don't mess around with historic buildings, because that was the first reaction. And so therefore, in terms of this sort of technique, this, in a sense, provocative campaigning technique, I rather agree with David Priestland that it's actually stirred up this whole incredibly interesting discussion, but it did have that downside that you got this defensive reaction on the level of just please don't mess about with our historic buildings. So I think the question of efficacy is a complex one. But can we move on to the larger issues, and then I'll take these comments from questions from the floor. Can I just remind you that there are 7 demands from Rhodes Must Fall. I'll read you parts of them. Oxford acknowledges and confronts its role in ongoing, I stress ongoing, physical and ideological violence of empire. Number 2 is recontextualize iconography, which we've dealt with. Number 3 is decolonization of curriculum. And I'd love to hear some more. Can we have some time on that? Because I think that's a really interesting issue. Say the history curriculum, for example, but also the question whether decolonization is precisely the right concept with which to get at this. I'm not sure about that. Representation of people of colour at all levels of the university, faculty and students. So if we just take those 3 issues, for example, and perhaps in the comments and questions we could move on to those broader issues. I saw the lady over here, Paul Flather, William Baynard, and the lady in the yellow T-shirt. If you could kindly identify yourselves and speak up. Thank you.
My name is Philip. I'm a student at St. Antony's. I'm doing an MSc in African Studies. I just wanted to draw the kind of, to the greater issues at hand here, because I feel that we are circling kind of similar issues and not really pointing out how that unfolds in life outside the university as well. Because what I think RMF has been really good at is at shining light on how Oxford kind of deals with minorities, with representation, etc. And I think that's incredibly important because as a student of colour at this university, I have noticed these things myself. But on top of that, this side of the table has, kind of hinted that perhaps it's not as important as greater issues going on outside. I wouldn't say that's the case at all. But just thinking of issues outside, they are pretty much the same as the RMF's demands within the universities. You can look at the Oxford University as kind of a microcosm of Britain today. There are issues of representation at all levels outside, in the working world, at schools. The curriculum needs to be decolonized or at least, vastly renovated outside as well, at primary school, at secondary school education level. As someone who's undertaken a majority of my education here in the UK, studying history here is total farce, regardless of whichever board you undertake your examinations with. And I think those kind of things, there's a system, there's a structure here. Talking about racism as an attitude doesn't really get us anywhere. We think about racism as a structure and how those structures keep being reproduced at all levels, especially here at Oxford.
Just in 2 sentences, you said how Oxford deals with minorities. I'm assuming you think badly, but could you just spell that out in 2 sentences?
Inadequately would probably be more accurate. I think that there are certain ways of making students feel welcome. That if you read the student union's study last year about how black and ethnic minority students, and that includes international students who are students of colour, how they feel welcomed here at the university and how they perceive their position here at the university, and how they are treated in terms of microaggression, in terms of outward racism towards them. Those are things that feed into the greater structures, right? Those are things that are not being helped by the greater structures. And I think that paucity of support is definitely a very strong issue here.
Thank you very much. Paul Flather.
I want to talk about representation, but can I just make a couple of very quick remarks? First of all, debate is important, so this is terrific to continue this discussion. Number 2, symbols matter. Monica and others have stressed that. In India, as you rightly said, there is this graveyard of viceroys. I visited it. Hardly anyone does. More importantly, the plinth on which George V stood has been left empty and is a constant source of discussion. So here's something to Rhodes Must Fall. The plinth can be left empty, and you can then deal with the argument the Vice-Chancellor has made about if you remove something, then there's no discussion. Okay? So that's quite important. Thirdly, Oxford matters. It is and remains globally the most reported university in the world. I used to represent it publicly, I know that. We know that with Mrs. Thatcher degree ceremony and so on. So things that happen here matter. Now representation, I'm going to be, I guess we're among friends and in confidence, but I used to be quite senior in the university, and I raised this issue with the Vice-Chancellor. I am from Indian origin, and I campaigned on race. I was on the GLC and the ILA, and we actually introduced a requirement that every paper and every decision in London had to have a race, an agenda, and an environmental aspect. And we introduced that in the early 80s. And I mentioned this in a number of the policy meetings we had, and everybody looked at me in astonishment. There is no one who is racist here. We treat everybody equally. And as you know, this is the classical colour-blind approach. It's not fundamentally wrong, but it won't do. It's not good enough. Now, I actually think this is a terrific university. I love it. That's why I stay here. I want to be here. And I'm a product of it. And it is a fact that we work incredibly hard at outreach. Far harder than Harvard even begins to do. It is a fact that we interview as many people as we can at the point of entry, and actually spend more time at admitting students than any other university on this planet. I think probably an hour, more than an hour or an hour and a half per student interview. Some universities, Chinese universities, spend less than a millisecond. They do it by computer based on your exam results. And we have now, thankfully, foundation courses and so on, which give people introductions. So efforts are being made, but it's not good enough. And one of the problems, I think, going on to academics, is that the very thing that we value, which is collegiality, which I value enormously, can also be a drawback, because we look for like-mindedness in selecting academics. Of course, that's been trumped by the Equal Opportunities Act and so on and so forth, but there is that fact. So I think more can be done, but if we believe in excellence and meritocracy, then it isn't always easy to change the shape. But more work has to be done informally on outreach, on preparedness, on welcomeness, and so on. There's a lot to be done, and I think this kind of debate actually brings the thing into focus, so good for that.
Thank you very much, Paul. William Bynum.
I wanted to go back to the Rhodes Scholarship and scholarships and the argument that the past is no longer so much with us in respect of them. And I think it is, in the sense that, as Cecil mentioned, there was one black American who was a Rhodes Scholar in 1907, Elaine Locke, and then not another for 60 years. So in effect, even though probably Rhodes did leave the racial composition, or race was not supposed to be an exclusive element according to his will, most interpreters now think, in effect, the Trust for a long time didn't elect black American scholars, and for Southern Africa, not until the 70s, and then there were only a few. Now, that's a long time and a lot of scholarships, but more than that, 32 of the scholarships go to North Americans, actually to Americans, US citizens, and more to Canada, so more to North Americans every year. And that is in the will, and the Trust won't change that. And it does seem to me that a fundamental rethink would be valuable as to where the money came from, and hence who should be privileged or get the privilege of that money. And the Trust always says, well, it's in the will. Yet the Trust has, through the years, put money into very many enterprises which were not in the will. For example, the American Studies Center, or the Side Business School, or the swimming pool, and so on. And it also expanded globally the scholarships at a time when they could have focused them more on the regions from which the money originally came. Now I'm sure, these things have been debated intensively ever since I've been here, which is 18 years. And one of the ideas that's come up, just to be very brief, is that American Rhodes Scholars should in some way decide themselves to give up scholarships in favor of African Rhodes Scholars. I think it's a brilliant idea. It's been around for about 20 years as far as I know. The Trust, it seems to me, will not ever do anything to challenge American Rhodes Scholars because they are the heart of the alumni. They they are overwhelmingly the most important group. And of course, there are significant reasons to keep them on side. But how about a letter writing campaign by current students, whether Rhodes Must Fall or not, to American alumni with Rhodes scholarships saying, let's just do this. Let's make, for 5 years, let's make a difference.
Thank you very much, William. That's a great idea. Lady in yellow.
My name is Maskish. I'm doing public policy master's degree at Oriel. So my question first, I think, is a reflection on what Monica mentioned earlier about how these figures' history and their heritage or what they represent is not black and white. I think that's sort of the narrative that goes on, but I want to challenge it fundamentally because I think the idea that Rhodes was a product of his time also is loaded with the conception of what that time looks like and whose perspective during that time is considered important. Because colonialism and imperialism is kind of presented as, a product of these people's time, but at the same time, there were countries fighting against those values that subjugated them. I come from a country that was independent at the time when these countries were going through a horrible imperial, and massacres and all that. So I just really find it troubling when people say, when we teach about these people, they're really a product of their time, but that should also contextualize and put within the perspective of other peoples that were fighting against those subjugation and all that happened. And the second one is decolonization of curriculum. I think that's very much related with the other kind of demands, because having representation in a classroom and having maybe 50 countries represented in a classroom and have an instructor that has a completely different perception of the world or doesn't have any idea of where literature and other scholarship comes from would limit the interaction and the intellectual debate that happens, and that happens in my degree. So we have a very diverse student body, but we don't have a curriculum that fits that. So these are all very much interlinked, and they can't really work independently.
Thank you very much. So if we could focus on these two issues, quote-unquote decolonization of curriculum and representation of people of colour, faculty and students, and I think maybe if I go in reverse order, Professor Priestland, colonial history.
As an insider, I talked briefly about this before. There are debates within the history faculty about precisely these issues at this very moment, and as anybody who is students will know, who are do history, there are new courses being introduced, and there are big arguments about jobs and where new appointments should be and those sorts of things. Historically, of course, the history faculty in Oxford historically it was very British history oriented. English history. Certainly when I was a student, I had to do loads of English history, which I can't say I enjoyed very much. Now things have improved, but there's still a long way to go, and there are big debates about it. Now, I think I would come to, I'd agree with Paul Flather, who's another insider at this university. The problem is that I don't think people in these debates are racist. Absolutely, I don't. But I do think there's a lot of institutional inertia. And of course, it's a big problem when you're talking about changing a job from a British history person to a global history or a Latin American historian or whatever, or an African historian. It's very difficult to. Those are political choices about allocation of resources, and people become very committed to the status quo for obvious institutional reasons, not for political reasons or for racist or issues about ethnicity. And that's why I actually think that campaigns like this can make a difference, because it brings the issue into the open. And as Paul Flather says, there is a sort of complacency in a lot of institutions, including this one, and the campaigns like this can make a difference. I think for various reasons we need to make the curricula of history and of other humanities faculties, no doubt, more globally oriented, and that is partly for for reasons of appealing to ethnic minority applicants, but also because we claim to be a global university, and that is not really compared with American institutions. These are not global departments. American universities have had much more. I don't know the history of it. I don't quite know why, but they are much more global than Oxford is, and I think it will take some time. But I think campaigns like this can actually help, even if they are divisive. So I think, that would be my position on the campaign.
But David, can I push on this? Is decolonisation the right term? Or is it rather, because that suggests that you have almost a colonial curriculum that needs to be decolonised, or is it insular versus global?
No, I think I would agree. I think that would be my perspective, that it's more insularity, and is my perspective from my own experience. I mean, I'm not saying, there may be, I don't feel that my colleagues, and that may be my blind spot, I don't feel my colleagues have some colonial agenda. I mean, admittedly, at one time, English history, the curriculum, as it was established in the 19th century, could be said to have had some colonial element. Absolutely. Because the history faculty was there to train up often imperial civil servants. And a lot of the English history curriculum, all this English history, was really about training people up to see the British form of progress, English form of progress, Whig history, democracy could be applied to the rest of the world. That went a long time ago, and I would say that that is not a perspective that I see among my colleagues at all, or in question set, or if you do British history, those are not questions you would be dealing with. You would not be given readings that would promote that view. I think the issue of expanding it to global history is more about turf wars, basically. People want to keep the jobs in the areas they're interested in. There are other arguments. There are stronger arguments, actually, about saying, well, we're a centre of excellence for the excellence in these types of history. We've built up schools in these types of history. We've got good graduate school on these things, and therefore to reduce the number of jobs and give those jobs to other new areas, or new for Oxford, or to more global areas, that would undermine those. There's another argument about small areas that are under a threat, like medieval history. These are under threat nationally. We ought to be keeping them in Oxford to preserve them. So there are lots of arguments in favour of the status quo. I think the status quo is still too strong, and I think there is a very strong argument, particularly given the interests of non-minority students, as well as minority students and global students. Given their interests, I think there are very strong arguments to move in a more global direction.
Yes, I mean, if I could just comment on that as someone who read history here in the 1970s, where we had compulsory courses in vast tracts of English history, and actually, there are two different ways you could read that. One would be, as it were, the empire builders narrative, but that was more a narrative of British and Great British and Greater British history, right? So Sedley said there was Great Britain, which was the first empire, and then there is Greater Britain, which was the empire, the colonies. I think that had very largely disappeared along with empire, but what remained was an insular, often Eurosceptic, not to mention global skeptic narrative of our island story at a higher level, right? The Anglo-Saxons, Round versus Freeman, ancient English freedoms which were expressed through our constitutional government and so on. So I suspect that's more typical of the traditional Oxford English history curriculum.
Yeah, but I would say that's gone now.
Yes.
I would say absolutely. If you're doing British history, you would be doing issues of gender, of the sorts of issues that are fashionable in across academia now, and basically it's a sort of centre-left faculty, but it is parochial rather than global.
Yeah. Yes. So I think that is indeed the point. David, would you like to perhaps focus a bit? Comment on whatever you like, but I know you've thought quite a lot about this issue of quote-unquote diversity in faculty and students. Would you like to say something about that?
Yes, thanks, Tim. Could I just make a quick point about the curriculum? And this is important. I've said it, at the beginning. we're all students, and it's not necessary for students. This is not. I'm not an apologist for Oxford's curriculum. I've taught here. I'm an insider too for 13 or 14 years. So I'm not an apologist for Oxford's curriculum, but I'm also a psychologist and a believer that the construction of knowledge isn't just one way. When I was a student and I read psychology, I was fed with a sort of what I consider to be a one limited worldview. But I sought out, a Marxist view of psychology because that fitted more naturally with my thinking and my being a political being and so on and so forth. I also want to, I think the comment from one of our students about extending this debate more widely. I think what this debate has taught us tonight is that there's clearly some things that are internal to Oxford, and what matters to Oxford and is important, but is also important to other, to other sectors of our society. But there are questions outside of Oxford, which I don't think we should conflate. Now, the question about the British curriculum and what we all learned in our primary schooling here, to focus on where Rhodes was. Some of my own students are in the room, and just a few days ago, we spoke about the attempt to reconstruct Zimbabwe's school curriculum in the 1980s. And on the table, a former alumnus of St. Antony, Fei Chung, who fought with the guerrillas in the war, became the first Minister of Education, drove hard a curriculum on political economy for Zimbabwe. Now, this rattled the churches, it rattled curriculum developers. You see the same trend in Julius Nyerere's Tanzania, who advocated for a socialist curriculum, a curriculum that didn't divide between mental and manual labour. These debates are not new. I work in some of these countries. Rwanda, who's just undergone a radical transformation of its curriculum, putting at the centre its genocide and so on and so forth. So these are big questions that live and reside outside of Oxford. But of course there are important questions that live and reside within Oxford, what we do with the Oxford curriculum. But my point throughout this debate has been a conflation of the outside and the inside is problematic. And we have to ask the question, from whence does the leadership come? If the question for the Rhodes Must Fall campaign is a question about racial equality, about more diversity for staff and students, it's with great interest. I have lunch at St. Antony's and people say to me, "Are you the only black Oxford academic? You must be carrying a tremendous weight on your shoulders." But there are at least 3 of us at St. Antony's, and I know of several more in this university. So the question really is, from where does the leadership come? And I don't suggest that all of my colleagues think in the way that I do, who are of black and minority ethnic persuasion, but it does seem a little bit of an insult to people who've been working for 14 or 15 years in attempting to diversify Oxford. The very interviews we do with black and minority ethnic students who want to come here is one that suggests Oxford is building and continually rebuilding. It is not one that suggests we are a university in crisis, that we don't actually know what we are doing, that we are explicitly racist or institutionally racist. Our focus has always been on building and building, but this is not to say that Oxford doesn't have problems of diversity and so on, but it is how these campaigns are fought. And sadly, I think, to deal with these issues of importance would be to de-link it from the Rhodes Must Fall campaign that is drawing the ire of many communities and leaders in South Africa because of where it's going, and to focus squarely on the issues that affect this university in a way that is really very important.
David, can I quickly press you just on the faculty point? Put it very simply, why do you think it is that there are so relatively few faculty of colour at Oxford?
It's a, I mean, it's a complicated question. I don't have the. I mean, if I
relatively.
Relatively. I mean, if I had the data would be, well, how many applications do we get? And of course, there are problems as to why we don't get applications from as many black faculty as we should. But proportionately, I mean, you know, we've all been through. Job interviews and why one gets a job and why one doesn't get a job. But I don't really have the data to suggest that they are, black academics banging at the door of Oxford and being turned away in droves. Now, that is something that we need to address. What is it that we can do about the curriculum? What is it that we can do about particular centres of excellence? You know, should we have something that focuses on black history or colonialism or whatever it is that might be appealing to African or black academics, and try and recruit them to these posts? But it's a complicated thing to think that one can dismantle and take apart a university curriculum and build it with something else. I've seen far too many African educational systems to know that taking apart a curriculum in order to transform it is not a thing accomplished within not my lifetime.
I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, I have to say, sort of instinctively, and not as an expert on this, I'm absolutely convinced of what Paul Flather said, namely that Oxford makes enormous efforts to try and get students, particularly undergraduates, from different backgrounds. I mean, there's no question about that. They do enormous efforts, and therefore, to your point, David, the causes of why we have so relatively few, are more to be found in the educational system, in primary and secondary schools, and in the wider society, and the lack of motivation. With faculty, I mean, it'd just be interesting to look at it. Of course, the selection of faculty is a highly decentralized process in Oxford. That's one of the points. So as against American universities, where the provost can set a target and say, we're going to have more African-American faculty, that Oxford just doesn't work that way. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take very quick interventions from gentleman in red sweater, lady at the back who has a hand up, Paul who has a two-hander, the lady there, and then if you don't mind, I'm going to allow Monica and Cecil, representing the future, to have the last word. Gentleman in red.
Thank you very much. I'm Ugo. I'm a graduate research student at the law faculty at Oxford. I think we need to be careful with the ways in which we wield the terms excellence and merit in the debate, because it almost seems to me that every time we say that we need to diversify the student body or the faculty, people say, well, we mustn't dumb down the standards. These terms are highly value-laden. They're very political. What we think of as excellent, what we think of as meritorious, in many ways comes from several years of privileging certain epistemic traditions and constructing certain forms of knowledge as what's universal and what's right. And I think that when we talk about diversifying the curriculum, we also need to not depart from the concept of colonialism, because it's a much more insidious use of the concept now. Because if we bring students come here from all over the world. If they come here and we infuse them with Eurocentric ideas and we send them off to where they come from, that's an insidious way of colonizing the world all over again. So we must resist the notion that colonialism is not a useful concept in thinking about restructuring the university. And just finally, because there was a point made about the number of black students that come here on the Rhodes Scholarship, there was an application made to the court in the 1970s by the trustees of the Rhodes Scholarship to get women onto the scholarship. Initially, when he wrote his will, it was not the intention of Rhodes that women should be beneficiaries of his largesse, so to speak. But of course, that was seen as repugnant to our views in the 20th century, how much more now in the 21st century. So I do not believe that it's set in stone to have such a large number of scholars coming every year from America. And whereas the money where this came from in Southern Africa, we do not have enough representation of scholars from that part of the world. That to me is not a very cogent argument.
Thank you very much. When you said it's Eurocentric, I would like to say that If only English historians were more Eurocentric, it'd be a great broadening of their horizons. If we could keep contributions very, very sharp, please. The lady at the back there who's spoken before, so it's just a two-hander.
Just 2 points. First of all, I think it's highly problematic to say that black academics will only be teaching black history or African history. I think that there's a wealth of black students now doing postgraduate degrees and DPhils who will later become academics who are doing other subjects like physics, like chemistry, like American history, you name it, they do it. They're not just limited to doing African history. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think you can't divorce the issue of why there are only 3 BME academics at the most diverse college in Oxford from the fact that it's very hard for BME students to enter here in the first place. We know that most faculty members at the university tend to be undergrads or postgrads at this university. So if they are unable to get here through, not just through the Oxford system, but because they have been underprivileged since primary school education and high school education, in order to be able to come here in the first place, and then once they get here, be able to get to the level where they are in a position to later apply to become professors at the university. These things are linked, and I think, Dr. Johnson, that you said these things need to be, not conflated. But I think that there's a very specific link here that does need to be looked at, and I think if we don't look at how, if we decide that we're not going to conflate them, then we might separate them altogether, and I think that would be to the detriment of this movement in the first place.
Thank you very much. Paul, very quickly.
Just a data point. I just think we need more information. The only reason the university started collecting data on black students is because it's been forced to. It's actually now a requirement. But I'm not sure we're collecting any data on academic recruitment. So we need to know how many applicants there are, and then we can look at proportionality.
Yeah.
It may be that there's just very, very few applicants and very few selected.
I mean, I totally agree with that. I think
it's standard procedure in companies, in local authorities, in charities, and in many other countries. I just don't understand why we've been so slow on this.
Applicants
as
also
an institution that cares.
Applicants also have to declare. I'm not sure what I put on my form for a variety of for a variety of reasons.
I'm not sure it's been published yet.
the lady there.
I wanted to add to the point made about the Rhodes scholarships. I'm not sure how many people know that in order to change the proportionality of American Rhodes scholars to, say, Southern African Rhodes scholars, there needs to be an act of parliament, because Rhodes Will is actually sealed by acts of parliament, which is to Ugo's point that they needed to have an act of parliament change women coming into the scholarships. And that's why I think it's really important that we need to engage the broader community in England in these conversations about the Rhodes scholarships, because it's their leaders who are going to push back and change these acts of parliament and make things more fair. It's also, not many people know that in the US application process to become a Rhodes Scholar, there's almost no reflection of the legacy within which you are bringing yourself. There is no reference to Rhodes and to his atrocities. This is another thing, it ties in with this view of Rhodes as neutral. But in fact, if you want to be honest, you have to give the positive and the negative by saying he's neutral, or let's not talk about it, or you learn about it on your own. You're going to come away with thinking that the fact that there's money there for scholarships makes him positive, makes it positive. And I think in the US especially, the scholarships are seen as a sign of prestige, and there's very little reflection from the US, from other countries as well, Australia, Germany, on the legacy in which they're situating themselves, and that's a problem.
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting column. Just if I may, I don't know if William, just a clarification, because I didn't know this point about the terms of the trust. Is that right that they require an act of parliament?
Yeah. Well, all wills do. I mean,
No. I can, William.
The answer is I don't fully know, but I do know that the terms of the trust have been changed in the past, and that there's also quite a bit of flexibility around expenditure of money beyond the very basic requirements. which include, by the way, a horse, 2 horses and a carriage for the Prime Minister of South Africa.
I can almost guarantee it's within the Acts of Parliament. I've spoken to some of the Rhodes trustees.
Right, thank you. 2 horses and a carriage.
No,
from,
that was a joke.
from
What I mean is that it doesn't seem to me that it may or may not need an Act of Parliament to do this, but it doesn't seem to me that a movement that called on American Rhodes scholars in the past to say now's the time that this needs to be rethought. That's what I'm really arguing for. I don't think anything will happen without the support of American Rhodes scholars, unless, of course, you can mobilise the British Parliament.
And Bill Clinton, maybe. Now, would either of you two like just very quickly? Just very quickly. David, do you want to make a quick point?
Very, very quick point, and I think, Nasima, you've raised an absolutely excellent point. So if applicants to the Rhodes Scholarship don't know the legacy of Rhodes, it would be an interesting question to know how many African-American students or black students would accept such a scholarship if they knew. So would they principally decline it or not? I mean, years ago I was in the position to take a Ford scholarship to America, but my political principles didn't allow it. It was huge amounts of money. So it'd be really interesting to throw this debate open and say, if they knew the legacy, would they take the money? And is that a matter of principle?
Sorry, may I just respond? So I'm from Zimbabwe, which used to be Southern Rhodesia, and I'm a Rhodes Scholar. And I can tell you, and I've had this conversation with my colleagues, we accept it, and we accept it as sort of reparations. We see it as coming back to the place, and actually, relish the fact that I can take Rhodes's money and do with it what he wouldn't have wanted me to do. And I think that's a really important topic, because most of us see this as reparations.
Thank you very much. David, a quickie.
Yeah, just a quick point. I know we've run out of time, but I know we were intending to talk about donors and influence of donors, and I know this isn't, but I just think it should be raised briefly, because I think that was a very worrying development, and it's actually something which I think we perhaps needed another discussion about, because of course there is the whole question of donors having some influence on free speech, indeed, and on the debate, at least. And we've seen this sort of thing happening in the United States, for instance, with the case of Stephen Salaita, the Palestinian who was de-appointed by the University of Illinois, and that was, as we discovered afterwards, to do for anti-Israel tweets and again a free speech issue, and that was on the it was subsequently discovered under pressure from donors, and I think this issue of donors is something we all have to think about as academics, because I'm not sure what I would have done on Oriel governing body if that were if we once told that you're a member of a charity and you have some requirement to, or you're a trustee of a charity and you have some sort of requirement to not to undermine the charity's financial position by doing these sorts of things. So I think that is another debate, perhaps for your free speech debate.
Thank you, David. Last word will go to Monica and then Cecil. Monica.
Thank you. So I'll just address 2 issues in my closing remarks. The first, the decolonization of the curriculum, and the second, the diversity question. So my first question is, what does decolonization of the curriculum actually mean in practice? Are we talking about adding an additional lens to particular disciplines, or are we talking about outright dismantling or indeed replacing the lenses that we already have, and for what subjects? So while I support the latter, adding lenses, while I support the former, I don't support the latter. And the reason for that is that simply in Oxford, we are in the heartland of the West and of the European intellectual tradition. And it is our legacy, and I think we're justified in upholding it, because education cannot be all things to all people, however much we would like it to be. Of course, it's important to be aware of our epistemic limitations. I don't mean to downplay that at all. And we have a lot to do and to improve in that respect. We need to acknowledge the blind spots and the inescapable nature of our subjective Eurocentric experience. But I don't believe that requires or should require the wholesale abnegation of that intellectual trajectory. I'm not a student of post-colonialism, so I'll ask you to forgive me if what I say next sounds simplistic. But my impression of post-colonial studies is that they are at something of a stalemate, constrained by a fixed and indeed obsessive critique of the West that actually serves to limit the discipline from intellectual progress. The post-colonial project operates within the ideational constraints of colonial history and hasn't moved beyond deconstruction to solution. It's hindered by what I would describe as exclusionary narratives, identity politics, and politics of resentment, and perhaps even retribution. What's missing, to my mind, is an inclination towards solidarity and ambition to build new intellectual and social alliances that strive for a more equitable and collectively empowering world. The process of moving forward is necessarily, I think, a dialectical one, with two elements, decolonization, which is the self-reflective work of the colonized, and de-imperialization, if you will, which is the self-reflective work of the colonizer. And it seems to me that neither side of the colonial divide has really figured out a way to respond to and transcend that legacy. If the colonizer and the colonized don't together address the history of imperialism and colonialism, I don't see how we can expect to build a genuine solidarity across diverse ethnic and identity lines. Finally, the issue of inequality, and I'll actually bring in some statistics because I think that's important. Those have been neglected so far in the debate. Oxford admits around 30 black students per year at the undergraduate level. So I think it's indisputable to say that underrepresentation is a real issue. A number of studies have shown that black and other British minority students who apply to selective universities are much less likely to be accepted, even if their A-levels are on par with their white peers. And that involves both if they're achieving the same grades, if their subjects are the same, and if the competition for places is the same. The numbers are really telling. Only about 1% of the British undergraduate student body goes to Oxford or Cambridge. And of that, only 1% is black. In the whole UK, by contrast, the proportion of black and minority ethnic students is much higher at 16%. But then within this BME group, 60% of black students and something like 36% of Asian students attend only 30 universities, which by traditional rankings are politically undervalued, underfunded, and typically neglected in employer mill grounds. Another big problem is the allocation of research funding and institutional resources. There are over 100 universities in the UK, but 25% of taxpayer funding goes to 5 universities, 50% goes to 12, and 75% goes to 31 universities. Disproportionately, the universities attended by the majority of BME students are disadvantaged here. And importantly, the socioeconomic profile of students attending the well-funded universities is definitely more exclusive than the UK average. So there's a whole swathe of British students, often those who have a non-traditional profile, who are generally older and are more diversely ethnic, who are completely overlooked in the social mobility debate. So my final point here is that the diversity problem, as has been pointed out, extends far beyond Oxford and Cambridge to the whole of British higher education. And to my mind, the relevant question then becomes, where does the burden of responsibility to address these deep-seated systemic challenges actually fall? How do we distribute that? What can we fairly expect universities like Oxford and Cambridge to do on their own to redress the imbalance, given that they are in a leading position? And what needs to be done on a broader political level? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Cecil, keep it fairly brief.
Thanks very much. Well, I think today's discussion has been testament to the fact that the debate that's been sparked by Rhodes Must Fall is actually leading in a constructive way. And I think I thank the other side of the panel for engaging with our arguments directly. A lot of this discussion in the British media has been, a series of descriptions of us as neo-Maoist loons, and I don't think that takes us very far. And I think, while I understand your misgivings about how our confrontational approach might have unintended consequences, I think today's discussion is testament to the fact that it might move us forward. In terms of critique versus this attitude of destruction, I think one of the things that people haven't understood about Rhodes Must Fall in this broader campaign is that nobody's saying they hate Oxford. Nobody's saying they hate the situation that we find ourselves in, and that this place isn't one of deep value. But that should never prevent us from critiquing this place. There have been countless social debates that have taken place on this campus since its inception. In fact, it was born out of confrontational, fiery and violent debates. And it's confronted debates about the representation of women and come out on the right side of history before, and now it's confronted with this debate. And I would venture to predict that in 50 years, people will laugh back at those who defended Oxford's racist symbols, those who apologized for Oxford's shameful situation of representation and Oxford's current curriculum. And let's hope that that does happen. In terms of the connectedness of the issues, the only further point that I'd like to raise is that we can't separate the iconographical and the pedagogic space from the curriculum and from representation. The curriculum is not simply a set of policy documents that academics draw up. It's the entire pedagogic space into which a student goes. It's the subtle messages that they get sent. It's the representation of their class, which all go into the pedagogic experience of what it means to be a student at Oxford. And so when we say Rhodes Must Fall, we say that all of those interconnected issues, which mean that there's a continued marginalization of black students, black voices at this university, must fall. And this notion that we can pass apart and separate the parts that we like and the parts that we don't like is simply an indication that we're unwilling to address the evil and pernicious legacies of this university that for too long have simply gone down as unreflexive dogmas. And finally, I think we need to reflect on Oxford's symbolic power, because the importance of this debate is not just that it's happening at Oxford, but it's the incredible power that Oxford wields, not just in Britain, but in the world. I mean, this debate has reached the front page of the New York Times. It's engrossed many parts of Africa and Europe. And in many ways, sure, it was a slow news cycle in December, but this was one of the most important debates taking place in the world. And I think we need to realize that while there are a number of different social problems that give rise to many of the problems we've discussed, our symbolic power as Oxford has the ability to change not just Oxford, but the world at large, and that we shouldn't apologize for our failures by simply suggesting that they exist outside this institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecil. I mean, if I was being ironical, I would be tempted to say that that's a sort of wonderfully backhanded way of Oxford self-congratulation, something which Oxford is very, very good at. We always find ways ultimately of saying how wonderful Oxford is.
If Rhodes falls, then yes.
But I do actually agree with you. By the way, when you said Oxford was born in violent debates, of course it was actually born from violent debates with the French in the 12th century, which is something the English always approve of. So I think we can agree on that. I think this has been a really great panel. As you rightly said, it's taken it in very constructive directions. What I take away from it is that actually most of us don't feel Rhodes Must Fall was fundamentally about free speech, for or against. It was an act of free speech. It certainly wasn't a blow against free speech. The curriculum is clearly a big issue, and we need to think more about that. Curricular, actually, because they're different from degree to degree. I think the question of faculty is a very interesting question for us, starting with simply knowing more about what's going on, which in Oxford is always a lifetime's work to understand what's going on. The issue of student representation, I think, is extremely, and the student experience in this university. I think that's the difference between the objective, so to speak, and the subjective experience. And also, actually, a conversation about the future of the Rhodes scholarships which I think has gone in really interesting directions. I mean, I love William Baynard's proposal to appeal directly to the American Rhodes Scholars. That's something I hadn't heard before. It puts it in a different frame from putting the Rhodes Trust on the spot. And perhaps we could start with Bill Clinton, who, as you know, was famously America's first black president. So he'd be a good man to appeal to on this, particularly in an election year. But anyway, for all that, for a wonderful debate, would you join me in thanking our panel?